This is the first time I've ever had a proper stand for my camera, so I'm going to go over this. So I believe Jesus was a real person, and I know it's not a popular opinion among atheists, but it's the one that makes the most sense. I'll break this down best way possible, and hopefully it doesn't rain 20 minutes like it did last time with me going on tangents. But let's start out with something that most scholars will agree. Gospel of Mark is actually the very first gospel written that we currently have. Not the very first ever written, but the very first one that's included in the Bible. So, and earlier the sources to the event, the better. So we'll treat the Gospel of Mark as a 85-ish% telling of Jesus. So what does this mean? It means you can look at Mark and actually see how people of the time viewed Jesus. And you can see if there's anything in Mark that wouldn't be consistent with how people should view Jesus. So let's do this things first. Let's knock out a few mythicist things first. The Bible does not state that December 25th is the date Jesus was born. This isn't even extrapolated from the Bible. This is a thing that got rolling because the Catholic Church needed a way to convert heathens to proper functioning Christians. And heathens did not want to give up their holidays. And one that's universally across the board that was celebrated is the solstice. And so Catholics were like, oh yeah, you can keep this holiday. Just make it all about this new God. And so they replaced Jesus with a lot of their traditional holidays. But the heathens kept celebrating Christmas the way they did. So it was halfway effective, maybe. But December 25th has nothing to do with the Bible. Neither does Easter. The date of Easter was also was due to trying to replace a pagan holiday with a more Christian one. Jesus has nothing in common with Horus or Egyptian mythology. These are things that are not congruent with how Jesus lived or even found in the Bible. There's a lot of things that Christians believe that is just theology, not actually something that is biblically supported. So, there. So anything that you use against for Horus or another ancient religion just needs to be casted out, because those don't actually apply to Christianity until later. We're talking about Jesus, which would have been the original point of Christianity. So another one is that so let's look in to see what the Jews thought a Messiah was. So the word Messiah and the word Christ or Christos is meant anointed one, and anointed one is actually the Aramaic Hebrew word for king, because what they did back in the day is they anointed their kings, and then that was basically divine right rule, which is how the Hebrews thought that their government worked. Kind of like how the Egyptians literally thought that their king was the reincarnation of a god, even though their king was alive during the last king's reign. So how the heck can it be the same god reincarnated? That's beside the point. It's a similar belief. It's basically they believed this because it was more convenient. So let's just get this. Jesus did not say Messiah meant son of God. That's not what it meant. It meant king. So Jesus presented himself as the king of Israel, the rightful king of Israel. So this meant that he needed to be descended from David. So the first invention in the Bibles was that they gave two separate genealogies to get from, Jesus to David. And the thing is that Jesus' genealogy wouldn't matter because in theory, he was not descended from Joseph. So he was descended from God. This inconsistency, by the way, only works if the original theology of Jesus was that he was a king, not that he was the son of God. Because then they can be like, well, he's the king through his dad's side. You see, his daddy is descended from David. This works if the original claim was Jesus was a king. And it's the one that makes sense. That's also why the consensus story happened during the birth. The birth of Jesus, the consensus story would happen. And the consensus story also plays in part to reconcile that Jesus was a Nazarene. So they needed two things. They needed to say, he's descended from David and he was born in Bethlehem. Well, that's why the birth story is. But everyone knew Jesus was a Nazarene. He was Jesus of Nazareth, not Jesus of Bethlehem or Jesus of Jerusalem. He was Jesus of Nazareth. And so it only makes sense that he was from Nazareth. So that's why that birth story was there. It was reconcile a theological difference, not to reconcile two different stories, but Jesus was obviously from Nazareth, and so they tried to get around that by making a fictional birth story about him. So that's another thing. Jesus does not appear to be a whole cloth fictional character, because a whole cloth fictional character, you can get around those inconsistencies by just rewriting the history of the character. And we know this because that's how Zeus was worshipped, and how Ra was worshipped, and how other mythical beings are worshipped. They do that by rewriting the past, their own past. And eventually the worshippers that worshipped the previous version of the god would all just die, and so you would be left with the new cult. Well, that doesn't appear to be the case in Christianity or any religion that's based on a living, breathing person. Examples like Islam, Mormonism, Buddhism, for a fact. I'm listing 3 things that we know that their founders were living, breathing beings. Have the same inconsistencies because they couldn't rewrite the things that we obviously know about their founders. Joseph Smith married and had sex with a 14-year-old. Inconvenient? Yes, very inconvenient. Can't get around it. You can't write the 14-year-old out because it's a part of history. It's the same problem as with Jesus. They couldn't write out the fact he was a Nazarene, and they can't write out the fact he was crucified. 2 things because people knew that Jesus the Nazarene was crucified. So they had to invent a theology that can accommodate things that they would know. So they invented the dying Messiah theology, a theology that didn't exist when Christianity was being founded. So there's that. There is the dying Messiah theology that obviously didn't exist. And there's other things. There are embarrassments in the Bible. Things that... And the Apostle Paul made off-the-cuff statements about Jesus. These are not statements that... These are statements about somebody that... Let's do one at a time first. Embarrassments. The Gospel of Mark, which is the one I like to focus on because it's the earliest one, has things in it that you would not want for your Lord and Savior or God to be. Jesus is described as insane. And this is a thing that is highlighted in Mark that normal Christians don't pay attention to or read. There's a section of Mark where Jesus pisses off a Roman soldier. Jesus' brothers and sisters usher Jesus away, looks at the Roman soldier and basically says, "I am sorry, my brother is crazy. We did not mean to offend you." And they cart him away. If you read that in the original Greek, which is kind of hard to do, but if you do, the exact wording involved is basically Jesus was feeble-minded. That's something you wouldn't want in your gospel. You wouldn't want the fact that Jesus was rich in your gospel and he preaches a poor, humble message. If you read straight a reading of Mark, and even Luke and John, Matthew not so much, it is highly implied that Jesus was loaded. He had people whose whole entire job was to carry sacks of money. Not a little bit of money, sacks of money. Jesus being a carpenter also is viewed as him coming from humble beginnings, but carpenters back then made bank because they made everything for a village. Essentially, if you were a carpenter, you made everything in a given area. Jesus being a carpenter would allow him to be insanely wealthy compared to the people around him. I'm not saying he would live like a king or a duke or something, but he was not no simple peasant. In fact, Jesus has, it is implied in the Gospels that Jesus had his own slaves because Jesus had rules regarding slaves, something that normal lower class peasants would not have or even know what to do with. So there are things in the Bible that are called embarrassments. It's things that you would not want, and Mark is full of them. Jesus being crazy, Jesus getting in front of the Romans during his crucifixion and having no clue what's going on. Jesus not resurrecting. Yes, that's right. In the original Gospel of Mark, Jesus did not resurrect. He was basically, the tomb was found empty, and the girls fled and told no one. That's the story of Mark. That's not something you would want in your Gospel. That they went into a tomb, found it empty, because Jesus was crucified, and so that meant that his remains rotted at where he was crucified at, and so that's the story in Mark. So if you look at it, Jesus is presented in Mark as more of could be conceivably a historical figure, and I point this out because a lot of people goes, well, Jesus did this, Jesus did that. And I was like, you know what? So did Caesar. That's right. Julius Caesar was said to be the son of God, performed miracles, and died, rose again, and flew to the sky. At a bare minimum, the story of Jesus and the story of Caesar, same story. You know why they're the same story? It's because Jesus was originally viewed as a king and not as a god. And so a lot of the feats you see in Mark were stories as told if Jesus was a king that was persecuted on earth and died. Because that's what Jesus said he was in Mark. And so after he died, his followers basically turned him into God by a slow evolution of trying to figure out when he became God. In Mark, Jesus became deified when he died and went to heaven. Like, after he died, Jesus was adopted by God and went to heaven. Every gospel written after Mark pushes the date up to his ministry, baptism, birth. So you can see the evolution of the theology. That's another thing you wouldn't see in a wholesale religion, is the evolution of theology, because you can change the theology and take away things that aren't convenient for you. It is inconvenient that Jesus was a Nazarene. It was inconvenient that he was crucified, which is the reason why the Gospels worked around it. You would not want your God to be crucified. You would rather worship a person who was on the throne in Jerusalem, on a heavenly throne in Jerusalem. The reason why Jesus was crucified in the Bibles is because he was a real man that was known to be crucified. And it's also the reason why the Jews at the time did not believe he was the Messiah. Because they're like, the dude was crucified, man. No king gets crucified. No king gets that indignity. And so Paul of Tarsus, by the way, had a really hard time convincing the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. But he was able to convince Gentiles, because Gentiles came from a heathen religion, pagan. And so they can accept a dying Messiah because they're from a different culture. And because of that, a lot of Paul's letters were not for ex-Jews, but for Gentiles that he absorbed into the religion, because he was able to convince them way more easily that Jesus was a dying Messiah, because culturally speaking, they were very different from Jews, and that idea could be accepted by them. But the Jews themselves never had that idea that a Messiah could die, because to them the Messiah was a king, and kings don't get killed by the people. Definitely not by religious people. So that's a good theological argument for why Jesus was a real person, because a lot of the things in the Bible. There's also a couple other things. I'm going to speed up real fast. A lot of sayings that Jesus said did not make sense in Greek. A lot of the sayings of Jesus did not fit Greek idioms and culture. They made perfect sense in Aramaic. And I think the good example of this is take German and English. There's a lot of formal-wise, you can formally say a lot of things in English and German that are perfectly translatable. But there are sayings in German that do not make any sense in English. And they're not English idioms. They are completely German. One example is what the vulture. What the vulture is German for what the fuck. Okay? But if you just translated German without, changing the idioms up, it would not make sense in English. You would get a reading and I don't know, you'd be like, what the fuck is what the vulture? What does this mean? Well, you get a lot of that with Greek, Greek in the Bible, with New Testament Greek. And that's because it's believed that the original sayings were in Aramaic. And so if you translate them back into Aramaic, they're Aramaic slang. Something so they were translated faithfully, or faithfulishly, you know what I'm saying, into Greek, like the literal words were. But it didn't make any sense because it was not Greek slang. So there's a lot of that. And this points to a real person saying these things and were then translated over. So there's, Paul of Tarsus was a real person also. And he claims he met the brother of Jesus. And some people say that, well, this is brother like heavenly brother. I'm like, no, it wasn't, because he was contrasting it to Peter. So he's like, this is Peter, the Lord's most beloved disciple. And this is John, the brother of Jesus. Well, you're not saying brother as in fellowship in this instance. You're saying brother as in blood relative, because that's the only way that word works. The Greek word for brother meant the same thing, kind of the same way that we mean brother, but it was very, very more stricter. It meant blood relative, or a person that you had solidarity with. Well, he's saying he just called Peter the most beloved disciple. So he could have said Peter the most beloved disciple and John the other disciple, but that's not what he said. He said he was comparing John and Peter, and John was called the brother of Jesus, the brother of the Messiah. Well, Paul wouldn't make this distinction if Jesus was a mythical figure. This meant that Jesus was a real flesh and blood human being. So I'm going to say two more things, and then I'm going to finish my argument, because I've been speaking for 20 minutes. And this is almost as long as some lectures go. So you have the fact that if you read the original Gospels, that Jesus didn't present himself, and you subtract all the additions out. And you can do this by just looking at the earliest manuscripts of the Gospels. Jesus did not present himself as God. He presented himself as a man who was a king. And he got killed for that. And he had no clue why he was getting killed. Jesus was presented as insane, crazy, things that you would not want. You would not want your God to die. The fact that Paul had trouble convincing Jews that Jesus was the Messiah is another thing of Jesus being a real person. Because the Jews who were from that culture was like, no, 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 no. Our king doesn't just die like that. Our king isn't a little bitch. But the Gentiles who were not from the Jewish culture was more than happy to accept it because that was acceptable to them. Because that's how their own mythology worked. So I'm just rehashing it, but the way the way that Gospels evolve. So I'm going to give you just one, and the fact that religions that we know had a actual blood human being in them. As I said, Mormonism had to work around John Smith's actual shortcomings. Joseph Smith, not John. Joseph. And how Islam works around Muhammad's shortcomings by turning them into triumphs, and how they did that for Buddhism. And pretty much every religion we know is based on things. They turn a person's shortcomings into triumphs. Well, that's what Christianity did with Jesus. They turned all his shortcomings, the fact that he was called an insane rambler, the fact that he died on a cross, the fact that the Roman state killed him. They turned all those into triumphs, which point to him being real, because that's how religions that deal with real people deal with their shortcomings. And before I go, I know this is long. Just one more thing. I've also talked about the language, how a lot of the idioms and things just didn't cross over into Greek very well, and that's how we know that it was originally written in a different language. So, I've talked about how Paul knew Jesus, and finally, I'm going to give an example. Ron Hubbard, we know, started the religion of Scientology. We know a lot about Ron Hubbard's life because he was a real person. Well, the thing is, Ron Hubbard in real life and the Ron Hubbard of Scientology are two different people. The Ron Hubbard of Scientology is this Superman that was able to that was like a reverse prophet that knew everything about the past. And is immortal. And it's just happened to it happened to leave the mortal plane because he had better work to do in the ethereal realm. That's literally what Scientologists believe about him. But what do we actually know about Ron Hubbard? Well, he was a guy that was caught putting kids on his yacht, got in trouble with the government multiple times, told Philip K. Dick and Isaac Asimov the best way to make money is start a religion and don't do all this writing bullshit. We know this, but 1,000 years from now, what will they actually know about Ron Hubbard the man if Scientology becomes a major religion? And that is not much. You would have the people that would critique the religion would have to take a lot of the mythical elements out of the religion to figure out what he was as a man. And even then, they'll see that they're looking through rose-colored glasses to see who the man was. And so if you do it that way, you can understand that even my referring to Mark as the best way to reconstruct Jesus, it's not the best way, because even then he's looked through rose-colored glasses. The same way that in 1,000 years from now, Ron Hubbard will be. They won't know about his famous quote that the best way to make money is start a religion. They won't know about his fact that he was caught putting boys on his yacht, because these are not things that Scientology recorded about him. They do record the fact he died, okay? And he's supposed to be immortal. They will record the failings of him. They'll have to come up with new mythologies to cover up the fact that he died and never came back. But they will not record the things that are truly 100% embarrassing unless Scientology is forced to deal with them. The same way that Jesus Christ in Christianity was forced to deal with the inconveniences of Jesus Christ. Scientology will eventually have to deal with the real inconveniences of Scientology that can be looked back and be like, well, they were said about 60 years after death, this, and this about him. Same thing about Jesus. So, I'm done. But I'm going to do a couple more things because I want to hit an even 30-minute mark and then upload this to YouTube. It's going to be one of my longest videos I've ever uploaded, come to think about it. So yes, the biggest arguments I have is it looks like Christianity was constructed around inconveniences of a living person, not made wholesale, because wholesale they can do a lot of things that, they could have made Jesus throne on Jerusalem. They could have made Jesus the redeemer of sins that fought sins and then rose from the dead and stayed on earth forever. They could, there's plenty of things you can do if you're writing a purely mythical figure. But it's pretty convenient if you know the guy died. And you're like, well, he rose again 3 days later, and then a month later he went to heaven. So there's no use looking for him. Because, And then there's a lot of things that were made way later, additions to Jesus' story, that aren't even in the Bible, just taken for granted by Christianity. And as I said, there's another argument I hear that I'm going to just tackle in 4 minutes is there's no archaeological proof that Jesus existed. Well, Jesus was a very common name. It was a name of like several religious leaders. A lot of people named Jesus ended up getting crucified, actually, which I find kind of funny. People was like, we can't name a Jesus crucified. Jesus in Damascus. There's one. So it is, and also the way you see in the Bible Jesus move around could make sense if Jesus was multiple people, and they were where there was one core person, and then they incorporated all these other people to make this composite Jesus. So, but what I was getting at is that during this time in Palestine and the in the Middle East, there was no actual records of any Jew at that point in time. We knew Jews existed. It wasn't like Jews didn't exist. But there was no record of any Jew of significance. Even the high priest of the Jewish religion wasn't recorded at that time. He was recorded years later. And there was Jewish rebellions around this time. There was actual people that said, screw the Roman Empire, we're going to start the downfall and kickstart the disruption of rule of the Roman Empire, which started with the Jewish rebellions and ultimately ended with the collapse of the Roman Empire. Because as soon as people got uppity and realized that they can fight the Roman establishment, they did. But that all started with the Jewish rebellions that steamrolled into eventually collapse of the Roman Empire hundreds of years later. But the Jewish rebellions was the first time that any Roman citizen got the idea that they can disrupt or overthrow Rome and then get traction. So it was a group of rebellions, and it ultimately resulted, as I said, hundreds of years later, but it was the start of the end of the Roman Empire. So, but none of the people during those time periods was recorded. Also, people don't keep this in mind, but it's completely true. The records for that time period was sacked when Jerusalem and Rome, during a Roman war, they sacked the temple and a few other places that would have kept libraries, and the palace. A lot of these places got sacked and burnt, and so a lot of the records for that time no longer exist. So even if even if there was a record of Jesus' crucifixion, it wouldn't have survived today anyways, because the places that kept those records burnt to the ground.